Look at the clock on your phone. That number is not a fact about the universe. It's a business decision, made in a Chicago hotel ballroom by a room full of railroad executives who had never been elected to anything. They pick the hour you wake up. They pick the moment your shift starts and the moment your overtime kicks in. Congress never voted. But the fact that private companies invented your day is only half of it. They did it because they were losing money on every mile of track they owned, and the leak was time. Boston, 1872. The most trusted clock in the city sits in a jeweler's window on Washington Street, brass and glass, polished daily. The jeweler sets it by the sun. When the sun reaches its highest point over Boston, that is noon, and it belongs to Boston alone. 60 miles west in Worcester. The sun crosses a little later, so Worcester's noon arrives a little later too. Ride another 60 miles and it slides again. Every 12 miles of east-west travel moved local noon by about 1 minute, which meant the country was not running on one clock or 50 clocks. Counts from the 1870s put the number of separate local times in the United States above 300. Indiana alone kept 23 of them, and Michigan kept 38. For 2 centuries, nobody minded. When the fastest thing in your life is a horse, a 4-minute disagreement between your town and the next town is not a problem you will ever notice. Sun time was free, self-correcting, and impossible to argue with, because you could walk outside and check it yourself. Then somebody built a machine that moved faster than the sun's own arithmetic. The steam locomotive did something no technology had done before. It moved a heavy object across 60 miles of countryside in 90 minutes, which meant that for the first time a single organization had to operate in 2 different noons at once. By 1880, there were nearly 100,000 miles of track in the United States, and every one of those miles ran on a schedule printed on paper. That paper had a problem. It had to state departure times, and departure times had to be stated in somebody's noon. So each railroad picked one, usually the clock at company headquarters. The Michigan Central Railroad ran its entire system on Detroit time, which sat 42 minutes ahead of the local time in its own Chicago station. A conductor pulling into Chicago was, by the wall clock outside, arriving in the past, and the pressure compounded fast. The transcontinental line closed at Promontory Summit in May of 1869, and across the 1880s, both total American trackage and passenger traffic doubled. Every new mile added another junction where 2 schedules had to be reconciled by hand. Every new passenger added another person who could sue when the reconciliation failed. Railroads by then were the largest employers in the country, the largest borrowers, and the dominant category of listed securities on the New York Stock Exchange, which meant the cost of temporal chaos landed on shareholders who had names, lawyers, and a very short attention span for excuses. In 1864, the town of Saginaw, Michigan, was served by 4 railroads running on 3 different company standards, none of which matched the sun over Saginaw. By the 1880s, the industry had at least 68 of these stacked on top of the 300 civilian ones. The Chicago Tribune counted 300 towns where one railroad kept one clock and a competing railroad kept another. In those towns, nobody read about the chaos. They looked up at it. Walk into the station at Buffalo, New York, and look up. 3 clocks. Different faces, different hands, all of them correct, each belonging to a different railroad. Pittsburgh had 6. A traveler there stood beneath all of them with a ticket in his hand, half a dozen versions of the same afternoon staring back at him, and nothing printed anywhere told him which one his train obeyed. A passenger riding from Boston to New York in the 1870s passed through 4 or 5 quietly disagreeing versions of the same day, and the ticket agent's real job was currency conversion, not dollars, minutes. Get it wrong and you miss the connection. Missed the connection and the railroad pays for the hotel room, the meal voucher, the rebooked freight, the spoiled shipment sitting in a siding, and the customer who takes his business to a competitor next quarter. But confusion was the cheap version of the problem. The expensive version was what happened when 2 trains believe different things about the same minute. 2 trains share a single track, running toward each other. There is no radio. There are no signal lights along most of the line, and the dispatcher in a telegraph office 40 miles away cannot see either one. What the crews have is a printed timetable and a written order saying the westbound train waits on the siding at a named station until the eastbound train has passed. The rule is arithmetic. One train owns the track until a stated minute, and after that minute the other train owns it. So the safety system of American railroading at the height of the industrial boom was 2 men in 2 locomotive cabs consulting 2 pocket watches and trusting. They agreed. Hand one of them a watch set to a clock 300 miles east, hand the other a watch set by the sun over his hometown, and every second of disagreement becomes a stretch of rail where both crews believe they hold the right of way. At 25 miles an hour, 60 seconds of error is roughly a third of a mile of contested track. The industry operated inside that gap thousands of times a day. August 12, 1853. Valley Falls, Rhode Island. Two Providence and Worcester passenger trains are closing on each other outside the mill villages north of Pawtucket. The southbound conductor is Frederick Putnam, 25 years old, promoted from brake work 2 weeks earlier, earning about $30 a month. On that salary, he could not afford a watch, and the railroad did not issue him one. So he borrowed a pocket watch from a friend who delivered milk. That watch ran 2 minutes slow. 14 people did not survive the collision, and 17 more were badly hurt. The wreckage became the first American train disaster ever photographed. A daguerreotype taken by a man named Wright from Pawtucket, and the image traveled the world. The inquiry blamed the conductor. Engineers inside the industry knew better. What had failed was structural, and it kept failing. Old Bridge, New Jersey, that same month, an engineer's watch 2.5 minutes slow. Mingo Junction, Ohio, in 1878, a conductor's watch 20 minutes slow. Belleville, Illinois, in 1882, a watch 54 minutes off. Every one of those became a coroner's inquest, a newspaper campaign, a wave of damage claims, and a line item on a balance sheet. Railroads were the most heavily capitalized businesses in America and the most frequently sued, and a disagreement about minutes was an exposure no underwriter could price. The industry moved fast once the bill arrived. Within a month of Valley Falls, the superintendent of the Boston and Providence line, W. Raymond Lee, walked into the Boston watchmaking house of William Bond and Son and arranged standardized timepieces for his crews. By 1855, the Vermont Central was buying marine chronometers, instruments built for ships crossing oceans, and issuing them to men running trains through dairy country. Nobody in those offices was chasing philosophy. They were buying down a claims bill. Long before America had time zones, America had a time market, and one man in Pittsburgh cornered it. In 1867, an astronomer named Samuel Langley took over the Allegheny Observatory outside Pittsburgh, an institution so broke it could barely keep the roof intact. Langley had a transit telescope, a set of precision clocks, and an idea. He tracked stars to fix the exact moment of local noon, converted star time into solar time, wired the signal out over telegraph lines, and charged for it. His first customers were Pittsburgh jewelers who needed accurate clocks in their windows. In 1869, the Pennsylvania Railroad became his first railroad subscriber, paying roughly $3,000 a year, something like $70,000 in today's money, for the privilege of knowing what time it was. Within a few years, the Allegheny signal was pulsing twice daily through more than 4,700 miles of telegraph wire, reaching hundreds of Pennsylvania railroad stations and, eventually, 42 subscribing railroads across the country. About 300 telegraph offices carried it on the Pennsylvania system alone, across roughly 8,000 miles of that company's line. By 1890, selling time had earned the observatory more than $60,000, worth over $2 million today, which paid the staff and funded decades of research into the sun. National Geographic later called Langley the first American astronomer to make the public pay for his profession. Time was a subscription product with a price, a delivery network, and a customer list. The whole arrangement worked because no public standard existed, which is why the Naval Observatory killed it simply by giving signals away, free starting in 1883. Precision had an owner right up until the moment the government decided otherwise. So why didn't Washington step in? Not for lack of proposals. In 1869, a schoolmaster named Charles Dowd, who ran a seminary in Saratoga Springs, New York, worked out the mathematics of dividing the continent into hourly belts and carried his plans straight to railroad officials. They listened. They did nothing for over a decade, and Dowd spent the rest of his life watching other men implement his arithmetic. In 1904, at the Delaware and Hudson crossing in his own town, a train ran him down. Up in Canada, the engineer Sanford Fleming was pushing a global system of hourly zones after a railway guide printed PM, where it meant AM, and stranded him overnight at a station in Ireland. Cleveland Abbey, the meteorologist who essentially founded American weather forecasting, published a formal report on standard time for the American Meteorological Society in 1879, arguing that a scientific nation could not keep running on 300 private noons. Bills reached Congress, petitions circulated, and scientists testified in front of committees that nodded and moved on to the next order of business. Nothing passed. Not one line of federal law. Britain had disposed of the same problem in 1840. The Great Western Railway put every station on London time. The other companies copied it within a few years, and by 1848 most of the island ran on Greenwich. Even there the law lagged behind the rails. An English court ruled in 1858 that legal time was still local time, which left Greenwich running the trains but not the courtroom, and Parliament only closed that gap with the statute's Definition of Time Act in 1880. Still, Britain is compact and built around one dominant city, so a single railway's decision propagated across the island almost by accident. America was 3,000 miles of contested longitude, governed from a capital with no appetite for telling Ohio what hour it was, and stitched together by thousands of competing private corporations who agreed on almost nothing. Same problem. Completely different machine for solving it. The Constitution says nothing whatsoever about time. It gives Congress power over weights and measures, over commerce, over the mail. But the hour of the day was treated as a municipal matter, something a city council set and a church bell announced. A congressman who voted to overwrite the local noon of the town that elected him was voting to take away something his constituents could verify with their own eyes at midday. That is a career-ending vote with no organized constituency behind it. So the men in Washington did what politicians do with a problem that has diffuse benefits and concentrated outrage. They left it alone for 30 years. So the authority sat there unclaimed, and the man who eventually picked it up was not a senator, an astronomer, or a robber baron. William Frederick Allen was a civil engineer from New Jersey who held two jobs that mattered more than any office in Washington. He was secretary of the General Time Convention, the trade body where railroad managers coordinated schedules, and he was the editor of the Traveler's Official Railway Guide, the monthly volume that printed every timetable in North America between two covers. Allen did not theorize about the chaos. He typeset it. Every month he assembled the contradictions of 68 time standards into one book and watched them fight each other on the page. Nobody in the country knew better where the friction actually lived, and his solution showed it. Allen took the meridian logic the scientists had proposed and did something they never would have. He refused to draw the boundaries where the mathematics said. A clean system would slice the country at the 75th, 90th, 105th, and 120th meridians, and let the lines fall wherever they fell, through the middle of cities, through the middle of rail yards. Allen instead ran his boundaries through terminal and division points, the places where crews already changed, engines already swapped, and passengers already got off. He put the seams where the money already stopped, which is why the American time map looks drunk. Those seams follow the commercial gravity of specific railroad towns, and a century of federal law has never straightened one of them. Allen spent 2 years lobbying. He printed notices in the guide. Soliciting objections, he answered them, he drew maps, and he hunted signatures from railroad after railroad until he could walk into a room and say the industry was already agreed. On October 11, 1883, the General Time Convention met at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago on South LaSalle Street at the corner of Jackson and voted to adopt his plan. 4 zones for the United States, 1 hour apart, effective in 5 weeks. The resolution folded the railroad times of Columbus, Atlanta, Savannah, Cincinnati, Louisville, Indianapolis, Chicago, Jefferson City, St. Paul, and Kansas City into one central standard, a single hour behind Eastern. 10 commercial clocks, each with a city and a business community, and a stock of civic pride behind it. Consolidated into one paragraph. Allen's own draft called that Belt Valley time before Central stuck to it, and his plan carried a 5th zone named Intercolonial for the Canadian Maritimes. And the new Eastern Standard did not match New York either, running about 4 minutes behind the sun over Manhattan, while Central sat roughly 9 minutes off Chicago's own midday. Every major city in the country surrendered its own noon that autumn, including the ones that thought they were winning. Nobody held a hearing. Nothing was written into law, and not one voter was consulted anywhere in the process. A private trade association in a hotel with chandeliers and cigar smoke voted to redefine the fundamental unit of daily life for 55 million people, and the only enforcement mechanism was that every major railroad in North America had agreed to obey it. The hotel is gone. The building on that corner is called the Central Standard Building, named for what happened in a room upstairs. Sunday, November 18, 1883. In a Chicago depot, conductors and engineers filtered into the office one by one with their watches open in their hands. The depot master had his chronometer under a magnifying glass so there could be no argument about what he saw. When the wall clock that governed every train in the building reached 12, they stopped it dead. It sat frozen for 9 minutes and 32 seconds. Then it was restarted, and Chicago had a new noon that belonged to the 90th meridian instead of to Chicago. In New York, Allen went to the Western Union building with his family to watch the time ball on the roof. The city's own church bells rang local noon about 4 minutes early, the last honest sunlight noon that New York would ever keep. 4 minutes later, the signal came down the wire from the Naval Observatory. The ball dropped, and noon happened again. The same second was noon in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Charleston. Crowds stood in front of clock towers and jewelers' windows watching hands get pushed backward by hand. The greeting on the street that day, according to the papers, was simple. "Have you the new time?" Newspapers called it the day of 2 noons. Chicago's reporters reached for the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, except the order this time came from a scheduling committee in a hotel. If this is the kind of history you came here for, subscribe, because that is the entire channel. Then came the fight, and it lasted for decades. The mayor of Bangor, Maine, threatened jail for anyone who rang church bells on the new hours. A preacher in Tennessee smashed his own pocket watch at the pulpit rather than accept a clock set by a corporation. One old man, confronted by a railroad time consultant, put the whole objection into a sentence that stuck. "Damn Vanderbilt's time," he said. "Put the whole to that. We want God's time." The Indianapolis Sentinel published a furious editorial 3 days after the change. Its warning was that the sun no longer bossed the job, and that 55 million Americans would now eat, sleep, work, and marry on railroad time. Even the planets, it added, would presumably be expected to make their circuits by a timetable the railroad magnates arranged. The tone is hysterical, and the analysis underneath it was exactly right. Holdouts dug in for years. Pittsburgh refused to run on standard time until 1887. Augusta and Savannah held on until 1888. Ohio fought town by town, and when the school board in Belair voted to switch, the city council had the board members arrested. Detroit was the most stubborn of all. The city kept its own sun time until 1900, then voted to move the clocks back 28 minutes, at which point roughly half the businesses complied and everybody else ignored it, so the city rescinded the whole thing and went back to the sun. Detroit did not settle down until the railroad simply refused to run on Detroit's clock, and the city surrendered in 1905. 10 years later, it switched again, this time to Eastern, because Detroit businessmen wanted to trade on the same hour as New York. Michigan had gone to Central statewide back in 1885, so Detroit spent 3 decades arguing with a decision its own state had already made. Nobody arrested a town for keeping sun time. There was no fine, no injunction, no federal marshal at the courthouse door. The holdouts lost because of price. If your town kept its own noon, your grain missed the train, your bank draft cleared a day late over a telegraph line that ran on standard time, your factory shift finished after the freight car left, and your buyers in the next county started quoting delivery dates you could not meet. Every hour of independence carried a surcharge, and the surcharge compounded. By the 1890s, the network had absorbed nearly every exception on the map. That is how standards actually win. Not through legislation, but through the cost of refusing, tallied one missed freight car at a time. And the railroads were not finished, because 1883 fixed the map without fixing the machinery. On April 18, 1891, near the village of Kipton, Ohio, a fast mail train and the Toledo Express met head-on, because a watch in one of the cabs had stopped for 4 minutes before restarting, showing a plausible, confident, wrong time. 9 people were lost, 6 of them postal clerks sorting mail in a moving car. The response was pure, private governance. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway hired a Cleveland jeweler named Webb C. Ball and gave him a title that had never existed before, Chief Time Inspector, and the authority to define what counted as an acceptable watch. Ball wrote specifications, movement grade, jewel count, accuracy tolerance measured in seconds per week. Then he built the enforcement layer. Every conductor and engineer had to bring his watch to an approved inspector on a schedule. The inspector kept a record book, issued report cards, and forwarded the completed cards to the division superintendent at month's end. Fail an inspection and you did not work. The railroad set the standard, the railroad collected the benefit, and the employee bought the certified watch out of a wage the railroad also set. A brakeman might spend 2 months of pay on an approved timepiece to keep a job. Ball built a national watch business on the back of it, and his slogan is still in your vocabulary. Get on the ball. and the specification outlived everybody involved. A railroad-grade watch had to carry at least 17 joules and stay accurate within 30 seconds a week. It had to hold that rate whether it lay flat in a drawer or hung vertical inside a coat, and survive the swing from a January cab to an August one. The dial had to be plain white with bold black numerals for reading at a glance in bad light, and the watch had to be set with a hidden lever under the bezel rather than by pulling the crown, so no timepiece could ever be nudged out of true inside a man's pocket. Collectors still use that vocabulary. What they are quoting, without knowing it, is a private liability policy written in a claims department. So what did the industry buy with all of it? Standard time let a railroad run more trains on the same rails. Single track is the most expensive asset in the business, and its capacity is determined by how tightly you dare schedule meets between opposing trains. Shave the safety margin from 20 minutes to 5, and you have effectively built new track without laying a rail or buying a foot of land. Freight moved faster with the same locomotives. Connections held, so ticketing across multiple carriers became sellable. Insurers could underwrite a system where every clock agreed. Contracts could specify a time that meant one thing in court. Then it escaped the railroad entirely. The factory whistles synchronized to the same standard. Wages became hourly instead of daily, which required an hour everybody accepted. On November 20th, 1888. A jeweler in Auburn, New York named Willard Bundy patented a machine that stamped the hour onto a card, with a separate key for every worker on the floor. His brother Harlow started manufacturing them the following year. In 1900, that time recorder business rolled into the International Time Recording Company. In 1911, it merged into the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, and in 1924, the merged firm renamed itself International Business Machines. The punch clock is the seed IBM grew from. A jeweler again, selling the hour back to the people who had to live inside it, except this time, the card in the slot was a legal record of what you owed your employer. Back in 1883, a physician named George Beard had published a book on what he called American nervousness, coining the term neurasthenia, and he blamed the new tempo of life partly on the railroad and its shrieking scheduled urgency. People felt the change in their bodies before economists put a number on it. Meanwhile, the government finally showed up. Sort of. In October of 1884, President Chester Arthur hosted the International Meridian Conference in Washington, and delegates from 25 nations voted 22-1 to make Greenwich the prime meridian. San Domingo voted against. France and Brazil abstained, and French maps went on measuring longitude from Paris until 1911. Greenwich won on a commercial argument rather than a scientific one, because roughly two-thirds of the world's shipping already navigated on Greenwich charts. That conference did not create a single time zone. Sanford Fleming was in the room and proposed that nations adopt standard time, and the delegates ruled the subject outside their purview, so it never reached a vote. One of the resolutions they did pass went out of its way to exempt standard time from the universal day they were defining. 25 governments sat in Washington 1 year after American railroads had carved up a continent and formally declined to touch the clock. American law took another 35 years to arrive. On March 19, 1918, in the middle of a world war, Congress finally passed the Standard Time Act, sponsored by Senator William Calder of New York, cleared in the House by 253 votes to 40, and signed by Woodrow Wilson. It defined 5 zones. Observance became a legal duty for every carrier in interstate commerce. The same act imposed daylight saving for the first time, which Congress repealed the following year over the president's veto, because farmers hated it. War is what finally moved the issue, since troop trains and munitions trains were now a federal problem, and no longer merely a shareholder problem. Congress did not draw the zones itself. It handed the power to define the boundaries to the Interstate Commerce Commission, the agency created to regulate railroads, and it instructed that agency to draw those lines with regard to the convenience of commerce and the existing junction points and division points of the carriers. The federal government adopted the railroad's map, appointed the railroad's regulator as the mapmaker, and wrote the railroad's own operational logic into the statute as the legal test. Boundary authority stayed with the Interstate Commerce Commission until 1966, when it moved to the new Department of Transportation, where it sits today. The test is still the convenience of commerce. So when a county petitions to jump time zones today, and several do every decade, it wins by naming the economic hub it already trades with. The Department of Transportation still runs those hearings, and the boundaries have crept steadily westward for a century, because towns on a zone's eastern edge keep asking for a later sunset and a longer trading afternoon with the city that buys from them. The reasoning has not changed since a timetable editor from New Jersey drew his line through a rail junction in 1883. Indiana is the live specimen. The state that once kept 23 separate local times got dropped whole into Central by the 1918 Act, then cut in half by the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1961, and its counties have been drifting across the line ever since. Indiana became the 48th state to observe daylight saving, and that did not happen until 2006. The same spring, 8 of its counties won permission to switch to Central Time, and 5 of them reversed themselves inside 18 months after discovering which cities they actually sold into. 123 years after that Chicago depot clock froze, one state was still arguing about whose afternoon it had to trade on. Which brings you back to that glowing number in your hand. That number arrives from an atomic standard, corrected by satellite, accurate to a level the Allegheny Observatory could not have imagined. What it measures, though, is still the artifact. Your zone boundary sits where a private convention put it. The workday you keep starts at an hour 2 locomotives negotiated on a single track in 1883. Your paycheck is counted in units a jeweler in Auburn made stampable in 1888. The sun still crosses over your house at its own moment, 4 or 9 or 19 minutes off from what your screen insists, and you will never once check. Standards look like physics and behave like property. Whoever solves a coordination problem first writes the terms, and the terms outlive the reason anybody wrote them. The railroads never asked for the authority to run your day. They asked for a schedule they could operate at a profit, and the authority came attached to it, quietly, permanently, and free of charge. They ran the numbers. You inherited the answer. Subscribe, because the next one takes apart another institution. Everybody assumes the government built,